welcome everybody to the final meeting of the General Obligation Bond, Environment, and Sustainability Subcommittee. I hereby call this meeting to order. We have interpreters here today to provide Spanish translation. Would you please introduce yourselves?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, my name is Elsie Duarte, and along with my colleague Carmen Cota, we will be servicing as interpreters in today's meeting. I will now introduce myself to our Spanish-speaking audience and review some guidelines. Buenos días, mi nombre es Elsie Duarte y junto con mi colega Carmen Cota estaremos sirviéndoles como intérpretes en la reunión de hoy. Al momento de hacer un comentario público, de favor les pedimos que hable despacio, con claridad y deténgase después de cada pocas oraciones para interpretarle de la manera más completa posible. Gracias. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. There will be a public comment period during item 3 on today's agenda. I am planning to reserve 30 minutes for public comments, but I will decide the duration and time limit for each speaker based on the available time and the number of individuals registered to speak. If you are attending in person and would like to speak, you will need to sign up at the kiosk located at the entrance to the council chambers before item number 3 begins. If you are attending virtually or watching a recording and would like to speak at a future GoBond committee meeting, please note you will need to register at least 2 hours prior to the start of the meeting. You may register to speak at Phoenix.gov/bond/meetings. Our first agenda item today is approval of our minutes from our meeting on September 22nd. Would a subcommittee member please make a motion to approve the minutes?
A motion to approve.
Thank you, Subcommittee Member Edwards. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. And all those is there any discussion on the matter? No. All those in favor of approval of the minutes, please say aye.
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 Thank you. And all those opposed, please say nay. And anyone abstaining, please indicate. Thank you. Meeting minutes are approved. Our next agenda item is introductory remarks. First of all, I would like to wish everybody a happy Indigenous Peoples Day today. I would like to honor this day with a short land acknowledgement. The city of Phoenix is located within the homeland of the O'odham and Peepash peoples and their ancestors, who have inhabited this area from time immemorial. And they have been the caretakers of this landscape to present day. The landscape is sacred and reflects cultural values central to the O'odham and Peepash way of life and their self-definition. Today, the Acoma O'odham are part of the 4 Southern Tribes of Arizona, which is a coalition comprised of the Gila River Indian Community, the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian Community, the Chin Indian Community, and the Tono O'odham Nation. In addition, Arizona is home to 22 tribes, each with its own rich history, culture, language, and land base. Furthermore, Indigenous peoples from within and well beyond Arizona currently inhabit the greater Phoenix metropolitan area. As an Indigenous woman myself, I honor and commit to nurturing my relationship with the Acoma O'odham and other Indigenous communities locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally, today and every day. We hold on to our diverse cultural identities because we have been taught to pass our traditions from our forefathers to our next generation. For Indigenous peoples, resilience is rooted in traditional knowledge, and adapting to changes in the environment is based on understanding of the land. In this subcommittee, we are tasked with making decisions that will impact our land, our water, our air, and therefore we are serving as honorary caretakers of this land today. Today, our city is facing a range of environmental challenges that threatens public health in our communities, and these threats are exacerbated by our changing climate. The decisions we are making today will affect all people within our city, from our elders to our youngest. The projects that we have before the subcommittee involve safeguarding our precious natural resources like air and water, and addressing environmental risk, and planning so that we will have more sustainable and more livable communities. I commend our subcommittee members for their courage to step up to help make the tough decisions that will help ensure the prosperity of our city through a lens of sustainability and equity for future generations. As I said at our last meeting, it is clear that members of this subcommittee have a desire to balance the needs of our city today with a vision of a city that we want to leave for our next generation. It is my hope that the bond projects that we prioritize as a subcommittee will be balanced and allow the city flexibility to implement a wide range of programs. Today is our last subcommittee meeting, and our critical task is to determine our environmental and sustainability recommendations to the Executive Committee. The subcommittee will need to determine which projects move forward to the Executive Committee and their recommended funding levels and their relative priorities. Following our last meeting, staff circulated a survey to committee members, and we will be seeing the results of the survey today as a starting point for our deliberations. It is important for committee members and the public to understand that those survey results do not represent the committee's final recommendation. I encourage committee members to be advocates for the project, receive more input from the public today, as well as that will help inform our subcommittee's recommendations. Finally, thank you to staff and the entire subcommittee. At this time, I would like to provide Vice Chair Steller the opportunity.
At this time, other than to thank you for those extremely thoughtful remarks, and also to thank you for all your leadership of our committee.
Well, thank you. Our next first provide the presentation.
Subcommittee meeting and look forward to the discussion this morning. I also want to thank the chair for those excellent and thoughtful introductions about what we're going to be doing. So, coming? Ready? Okay. So today, we will talk a little bit about the charge of the subcommittee, just to remind everyone of what it is you're charged to do. Review the identified projects that have been discussed in this subcommittee. We will hear a summary, as the chair indicated, of the survey results that the subcommittee submitted, and then have discussion, questions, the ranking, and then talk about next steps. So the charge of the subcommittee, I didn't click. Charge of the subcommittee is to determine the highest priority projects and programs of those that have been described in the subcommittee meetings. To then recommend funding levels for those items, and to only refer needs that cannot be reasonably deferred. So to talk a little bit about the scope of the challenge ahead of us, I'll go over the entire program, which is, as you know, a total list of prioritized capital needs before all of the 8 subcommittees of $647 million in projects and programs. As we have been told, we have capacity to do a program of $500 million in the coming year. That means we have an initial funding gap of $147 million, or just under 23%. To illustrate the scope of this challenge and put a finer point on it, this again is simply an illustration that shows the amounts of dollars that were allocated to each of the 8 subcommittees and how much of a reduction would be required in each individual subcommittee in order to achieve that $147 million reduction. And as you can see, the Environment and Sustainability Subcommittee was initially allocated $25.1 million for the projects that were identified. To do the 22.7% reduction, this subcommittee would have to get that down to $19.4 million. Again, this is only an illustration. You're not bound to these numbers, but as we know, the executive committee will be looking to this subcommittee's recommendations to help get the overall program into the $500 million envelope. So it is important to keep these numbers in mind. We are here to help today with this difficult conversation and facilitate that. And to do that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Chris Fazio.
Good morning, Madam Chair, committee members. During our last meeting, the subcommittee directed staff to prepare and distribute a survey for subcommittee members. The committee determined it would evaluate all projects identified in the capital needs study. That includes $25 million of projects that had been identified by staff as prioritized needs, and $32 million that had been categorized by staff as future capital needs. The survey assumed that energy and water efficiency projects were combined into a single project, including alternative energy projects, and that heat resiliency item had an expanded scope. We included an additional question regarding the fuel tank project at your direction. As discussed during the last meeting, the results of the survey are not binding. They're only a starting point for discussion. The survey asked members to rank order the identified projects, to flag any projects that members believed would require more or less funding than had been identified in the capital needs study, and to flag any projects members believed should be deferred to a future bond program. All committee members completed the survey. To adjust for outliers, we'll be showing the results in median order, with average used as a tiebreaker for any projects sharing the same median value, and counts will be shown for all remaining questions. So with that, here are the survey results. To orient you to the table at the top of this slide, the far left column shows the overall rank based on the survey, followed by the project name. Those asterisks indicate the projects where the scope was modified from the original capital needs study scope based on the committee's direction. Following that, the median rank, the high rank, the low rank, and the average rank. In this case, median rank and average rank coincidentally were the same. So in order, you have the energy, water efficiency, and alternative energy, renewable energy projects, followed by heat resiliency, city brownfields redevelopment, city vehicle electrification, and fuel and oil tank replacement. Below that, you have the responses to the question that was asked on the fuel and oil tank replacement project. So 6 committee members believed the fuel tank project should be considered by the executive committee, but not as a recommendation of the subcommittee. 1 member believed it should be considered as a recommendation of the Environment and Sustainability Committee. 2 members believed it should not be considered by the executive committee. So we can come back to this rank table, but I'm going to show you the same rank order now with the financial information behind it. So now you're looking at overall survey result, followed by project name, followed by the bond funded amount, counts of members indicating the project should be funded higher, lower, or not funded at all, and then a running total. Again, the prioritized needs identified in the capital needs study were $25 million. A pro rata cut would be $19 million. So if either of those figures were the ultimate amount recommended by the executive committee, based on this order, that would partially capture the first 2 items on the survey. With that, we can take any of your questions on the administration of the survey, but prior to any deliberations, we'd recommend that you take the public comment period.
Thank you for that. We will now open our public comment period for this item. We have 3 speakers registered today. I will give each speaker 3 minutes. We will start. Do we have any virtual participants? No. Okay, so all the speakers are in person. So when your name is called, You can come up to the podium here and begin your remarks. At the conclusion of the speakers, we will continue on with our meeting. I will now ask the city attorney to explain the rule of public comment in the Go Bond committee meetings.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Members of the public may speak to comment on the general obligation bond program. The city code requires speakers to present their comments in a respectful and courteous manner. Profane language, threats, or personal attacks on members of the public, council members, subcommittee members, or staff are not allowed. A person who violates these rules will lose the opportunity to continue to speak. The subcommittee and staff cannot discuss or comment on matters related to pending claims or litigation.
Thank you. I will now ask staff to call off the speakers, please.
Good morning. Our first speaker this morning is Diane Barker, followed by Vanya Guevara.
Good morning, Chairman Torres and committee. My name's Diane Barker. I did have the opportunity to serve on the last bond committee, so I know what you're going through, and I do appreciate your work. I'm just really coming, more on knowledge on what you have done, and I see here it's the fourth and final. I'm really dismayed that out of this whole portion of $500 million, that you're 25 for 19 million? This desert needs sustainability. I've lived in the desert for over 3 decades through 7 cities, mainly Phoenix. And when I came out here, I didn't bring a car. I'd been in real estate in Florida. And I was told that I couldn't live in the valley without a car. Well, I'm a Buckeye. I don't take, you can't do too much, like that. So I've lived in the valley for over 3 decades without a car, using a bus, bicycle, the rail now, walking, ride share, so forth. And I believe in sustainability. Right now, I have the pleasure of living in a 60-unit environmental LEED 8 building that's downtown that's a sleeper. The city put money into it. And where I am with you now on all these programs, we really need education for living in the Sonoran Desert. And all places, even this last week, we had the leaf blower. We're senior building. The leaf blowers coming right next to the door, and Phil McNeely, some of you know them, had gotten it so that they didn't do that. They washed it down with change of management. The managements in these buildings, they don't know what compost is. We need education. I don't see money for education there. I hear it may be in some other committees. But, projects where we could even bring, I'd been a school bus driver, we could bring down for trips with the children and show them, like an example, say around the convention center, where there's an interactive program, even with phones, that you learn about the plants, the animals, and living in the desert. You learn about your duty as a human being on keeping a clean trail. That means taking care of your litter. And so what I'm saying is I saw your 5 different areas. I agree with them, but I don't see anything really for sustainability, education of the Sonoran Desert, and I really believe it needs there. And all the RFPs all through the city need to have boilerplate. Your services and your products, you understand the Sonoran Desert. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Vanya Guevara in the upper council chambers, followed by Karen Goff.
Yekbeina Muchiameheme. Good morning, everyone. Vania Guevara, and also happy Indigenous Peoples Day. And I also want to remind us that we are currently existing on stolen land. I want to express my happy reaction and how grateful I feel that our community members have been heard, given the survey results prioritizing or having heat resiliency among the top ranked. I believe I shared my appreciation at the executive committee where committee member, I think committee member Chairwoman Torres was there, but also extend my gratitude to committee members O'Grady and Unrein. I think our members were really happy to hear your questions to staff be echoed and really be a voice for our community members, given that that's not always the case when we come to spaces like this, which could be really intimidating for communities of color. So thank you, we feel heard. I realize that this is not binding, there's still a process, but we hope that you continue to advocate for heat resiliency, cool corridors, tree shade equity for our community, because we all deserve quality of life and not have our life expectancy reduced simply because we don't have access to clean air and tree. I know for me personally, I've expressed this before, it's medicine for my mental health to be able to look out to greenery, trees, nature. I also want to take an opportunity to express the importance of transitioning into electric vehicles. Right now is the time to do it. We don't want to wait 30 years and wish we did something about it early on. And when we talk about, having our fleet being clean and green and referring to natural gas, that really isn't a solution. That also needs to be reevaluated and assessed, because that also can contribute to climate change the same way that gasoline does. So again, I just want to extend my gratitude. We will continue to come up and show up for our community, and we ask that you also keep us in mind as we advocate for a cleaner, greener future, not just the future, but today and now. There's an urgency, as was expressed in the last committee, where we talked about us being in a desert and it being extremely hot and it being a matter of life and death. So again, I thank you all for your service, what you've all done, staff. It's really exciting to be here and work with you all, and I just ask that this work continues. Thank you so much for your time, Padiush.
Our final speaker is Karen Goff.
Good morning. Pleasure to be here again. I'd like to echo what Vanya said about I'm thankful to the committee for hearing our comments and prioritizing heat resiliency in the survey. Another item that I thought I would provide some context for is after the last meeting, our institute, again, I'm director of the Applied Health Policy Institute of the U of A. And after the last meeting, we looked into some of the context with regard to electric vehicles. So I thought I'd share some of that and why that might be an important item for the city. So Phoenix has a fleet of about 7,700 vehicles in total. About half are classified as light duty, and as of earlier this year, only 13 of them were electric vehicles. And there's a general sense that the city wants to hold off on investment in electric vehicles because the technology might improve, the costs will go down in the next several years. I would like to point out, to emphasize that the timeline of this bond process is such that by the time these dollars are actually spent, that gives us several more years to have those costs decrease. And Phoenix did recently have an opportunity to vote on switching to EVs for some of the buses, and they voted that down. It's arguable that Phoenix's present plans and actions don't lead by example with electric vehicles as much as we would hope. Some quick calculations, assuming that there are about 750,000 vehicles registered in Phoenix, and that's a big chunk of the state's total vehicles, because there's only about 2.4 million in the state of Arizona. The city is expecting, by their plans, to have more than 1 out of every 3 private sector vehicles to be electric by 2030, but only plans to convert about 5% of its light-duty fleet by 2030 to electric vehicles, and has no plan for heavier duty vehicles, which we know produce lots of emissions. And so this is significant because the health impacts of emissions from gas-fueled vehicles are quite dramatic. Air pollution is still the largest environmental factor contributing to health problems in the U.S. And in the U.S., it's estimated that air pollution contributes to between 100 and 200,000 deaths each year. And this includes the mere fact that people live, work, or attend school near a major road has been linked to things like asthma, cardiovascular disease, brain function. I could go on and on about the health impacts, but as I'm out of time, I wanted to jump to that Phoenix has some of the worst air quality in the U.S. And the American Lung Association's 2022 State of the Air report ranks us the 5th worst in the nation for ozone pollution and the 8th worst for other pollution. And Phoenix got a grade of an F for every measure of air pollution. So consider that in your deliberations. Thank you.
Thank you. This concludes the public comment period. Thank you to all members of the public who have participated in this process so far. And thank you to subcommittee members for your thoughtful consideration of all comments, reports, memos, and data provided in presentations to date. Before opening the meeting to subcommittee members for discussion on our recommendations, I will provide a framework for these deliberations. Staff will be sharing a document on our screens to help keep track of deliberations. If a subcommittee member has a suggestion on adjusting the values or priorities, I will be asking informally for consensus among committee members. When there is consensus, I will ask staff to make live updates to the working document. We will make these adjustments one at a time and keep the process very clear. I ask that we plan to wait until the end of all of our deliberations before a motion is made to actually approve the overall rank order and dollar amounts. With that in mind, we can start our process of deliberations. And just as a reminder, we started at $26 million, around $26 million for this subcommittee. And in order to navigate that list to a reduction of 20%, it would be around a $19 million total for our subcommittee. But again, our subcommittee is open to also revise that as well. Those were recommendations by the city staff and city budget to follow that process. I would like to ask Vice Chair Steller if he has any recommendations on how to move this process forward.
One possibility I wonder is if we could actually begin at the bottom of the prioritized list and try to deal with the fuel tank replacement and potentially the electrification on the theory that if we can perhaps at least one of those, it seems like there may be some interest in moving off this committee. It may help get our overall number down and give us a smaller starting point to then have to make hard decisions about some of the others.
So based on, what I'm hearing you say is based on the rank order of committee members ranking and recommendations for the fuel and oil tank replacement project in particular, one idea is that we could have a consensus on whether or not we want to fund this project in this committee or whether we want to send it to executive committee with a recommendation that it's funded in an alternate project area.
Yes, Madam Chair, that is my my proposal, because that would at least take the $5 million. If we do decide to do that, then that would take the number down by $5 million and give us a smaller grouping of projects to manage.
Any subcommittee member thoughts on that? Committee member Edwards.
Point of clarification, are you suggesting then that, can I infer from that that you're suggesting that item 5 or fuel and oil tank replacement be stricken? And then that gives us the top 4, the other 4 categories that we use to prioritize spending?
Well, I'm proposing that we I don't know that I would say stricken, but that we determine if it will not be a recommendation of this committee and that it would be going to the executive committee, because my understanding is that if we went with the item that got the most votes about it be considered by the executive committee but not a recommendation, then in a sense we wouldn't think of that as part of our total budget amount that we were moving forward.
Madam Chair, I have a quick comment.
Go ahead.
Just so in terms of the fuel tank question and then how it was presented in the survey, by the way, staff, thank you so much for the survey. I feel like that's going to make our work much easier here today because we have $25 million to work from, either up or down. The way the question was presented, I would prefer to simply do a up or down recommendation versus going into the merits of what another committee may think or what the executive committee may think on the fuel tanks, and simply say, does it fit the environment and sustainability criteria? It doesn't seem like it does because there were 6 votes against it, and then move forward with the rest of the list.
Okay, go ahead and.
Sorry, go ahead. I suppose it doesn't sound like we need a formal motion, but within deliberation, I would suggest doing a simple vote on a recommendation to fund the tanks or not to fund the tanks.
Okay, so do we have consensus either one way or the other whether or not tanks will be funded in this subcommittee budget coming out of the subcommittee? Can I get a shake of heads either way?
Is that necessary, Karen? I mean, to follow the process that the vice chair was suggesting would indicate sort of the same. Is it necessary for us to call that out specifically?
So what we need to end up with is a recommendation, ranking and funding levels. And so if the consensus of the subcommittee is not to fund that project, then that would be what you put forward.
So we would send it to so there were 6 of us that voted, and I was one of them, I'll admit, that it should be considered by the executive committee. If we defund it, it goes to them to basically say, don't put any money towards it, because I think the money needs to follow if it goes to the executive committee, is my point. So I just want to get clarification on that. You see what I'm saying? I don't want to say, we vote no funds and then send it to the executive committee and say we're saying no funds. What's the point of that? So I want to get clarification, so maybe I'm wrong. If you could just clarify that for me.
So, Madam Chair, committee members, so the ultimate recommendation from this subcommittee would be projects that are recommended for funding by the Environment and Sustainability Subcommittee. If the committee believes that the fuel and oil tank replacement project should be considered by the executive committee, that shouldn't fall off, the committee in its memo to the executive committee could note that this project was not recommended by the Environment and Sustainability Subcommittee, but that the committee believes it ought to be considered by the executive committee. It's a subtlety, but I think what that would note is that you're not necessarily moving your recommended total up by that $5 million, but you are recommending that the executive committee consider it in its deliberations.
Madam Chair, my interpretation just of the results and the role of the executive committee is the executive committee can consider whichever project it wants over the recommendation of the committee or non-recommendation or recommendation against funding. My simple, I guess, recommendation here for our committee would be to vote up or down on the tanks. I feel like we're going beyond our role on this committee by saying do not fund, but maybe fund under another subcommittee, or the executive committee should fund. It simply seems, based on the merits of the project, that it does not merit funding from this through our scope of recommendations.
Yeah, I think the process right now is really just to eliminate some variables so that we can assign values to the projects that we do want to fund. And given that the fuel and oil tank replacement project ended up at the bottom of the list and a substantial amount of votes was for it to, be considered by the executive committee and should not be a recommendation of this subcommittee, I am kind of with Vice Chair Steller, where I think that one, I would be happy to forward it on to executive committee with that recommendation, because a substantial amount of our subcommittee members seem to agree with that in the survey. If there are any that disagree, please speak up. I want to hear that.
Chairwoman Torres, this is Shannon Scutari.
Go ahead, Shannon.
Yes, good morning. Thank you. I completely agree with what you're recommending and Vice Chair Steller recommends. I would just go right back to the language in the survey, which 6 of us actually endorsed, which is the project should be considered by the Executive Committee, but should not be a recommendation of the Environment and Sustainability Subcommittee. And if that needs a formal motion, I'm happy to make that formal motion.
Thank you, Ms. Scutari. I don't think it needs a formal motion. It's just for our deliberation process so that we can move on to assigning funding values and priorities to the other 4 projects that are on our list. So
Wonderful, thank you.
Everybody is comfortable moving forward with that? Committee members? Okay. All right, so now we are looking at our 3 or 4 projects here. I know that they're going by Vice Chair Steller's recommendation on starting with the bottom 2. I know there was some deliberation in our last meeting on the funding for EVs. There seems to be substantial funding in other sources for EVs and anticipated sources coming down the line. And also, according to Subcommittee Member Perez's comments, it sounds like the city kind of has a process and lined up or teed up to transition our EV fleet. So I don't know. I'm opening it up to comments. I also did hear substantial public comments in support of this funding for this measure. I think where it falls on the list of the priorities, I think is probably in line with how the discussions that have gone on in this subcommittee, just given that there is a substantial amount of funding out there for EVs, electrification of our fleets. Any thoughts by subcommittee members?
Madam Chair, I have a quick.
Go ahead.
I wanted to highlight a couple of things that, thank you again, staff, for the information between meetings that were very, very helpful. The letter from September 26th, in the bottom full paragraph, it says, I was interested because it doesn't say that we should put off funding. It says that we should reduce the amount of funding from this round of the GO bond. So this is last sentence. If the subcommittee desires to reflect support for electric vehicles to capture near-term needs, it is suggested that the subcommittee recommend only a portion of the funding initially requested versus what I thought the original recommendation was to wait until a future bond. And so what my preference here would be, given 1, the air quality issues, 2, that in my day job, I try to identify federal funding for cities. Public fleets are very difficult. That's, I think, why the federal government, the Congress put in specific USPS money for the federal fleet. For the private fleet, household fleets, there's a ton of tax credits. Corporate fleets, there's also a lot of tax credits. I have difficulty identifying where the city is going to find, except for competitive grants and maybe some CDBG funds, which I understand were also not what we expected for the city of Phoenix. I would not want to be in a position in 2029 where, looking back, our electric vehicle fleet is not where it is because we did not have enough funds to do the study, to do the implementation. And so my preference here, if we do not fund the fuel tanks, is to go ahead and take that $5 million and then allocate it towards an EV transition. So we reduce the EV number from 16 to 5.1.
Any other thoughts from
Madam Chair?
Yes.
Madam Chair,
go ahead.
Gene Adamo. Thank you. A question I would have about that, I don't disagree at all with the importance of the electric vehicle project. So just randomly cutting it from 16 to 5, is that going to be effective? When I'm looking at the numbers we have to work with, our number 1 and 2 choices by the committee overwhelmingly are already adding up to $31 million. So I just think we're not saying that it's not an important thing. It's just the reality is we don't have the money to work with. So rather than just start randomly cutting dollars from here and there, let's not cut something to where it won't be as effective. So your original, I think it was Vice Chair Steller, who said you look at the lower ranked ones and you kind of just unfortunately say we don't have the money to fund them and they go to 0, and then we work with the top 3 and see how that comes out. Because we have to come up with a decision, and at the rate we're going now, I don't know if we'll get there.
That makes sense. What the recommendations we've heard from staff in the past have been that these programs, they're not necessarily projects in front of us, that they're programs, and most of them are scalable. Right. Can we get confirmation from staff that all of the remaining 4 on the list are scalable? Meaning, if we allocated funding at a reduced amount, they would still be able to implement a portion of that program.
Madam Chair, members of the subcommittee, good morning. Yes, these remaining projects are all scalable. So whatever level of funding the committee decides and ultimately is recommended by the executive committee, and depending on the will of the voters, the city would be able to implement the use of those funds towards execution of that project to whatever degree the funding could deliver at that time.
Thank you. So do we have the live, is this the live editing feature in front of us here? Okay. So if we're not funding fuel and oil tank replacement in this committee by consensus so far, can we take that down to 0? And then we had a proposal to fund EVs at $5 million. Can we change that? And this is all editable, so again, I'm asking them to make these changes, but this is not what has to stay. So I'm just doing it for the purpose of our deliberations here so that we see what's in front of us.
Let me ask a clarifying question.
Yeah.
Reflecting my colleague's question to staff on the last paragraph, my read is not that the recommendation from staff was to lower the amount. My read on that paragraph is that if we decide to still fund it, it should be we should consider funding it at a lower amount. But could you please clarify if that's the case, or if the recommendation from staff actually changed?
Sorry, just want to read it to make sure I refresh my memory on what's in this paragraph.
This is in the last paragraph. I think it was the last sentence you were referring to, correct?
Correct.
The last sentence says, if the subcommittee desires to reflect support for EVs to capture near-term needs, it is suggested that the subcommittee recommend only a portion of the funding initially requested.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Thank you, Vice Chair Stoller. Yes, so recognizing the challenges you have before you in determining what level of funding, as we prepared this report and Chief Sustainability Officer Hartman and I discussed the prospect, we certainly recognize the city have a deep desire to transition our fleet to electric vehicles, and we still have an unknown with respect to the infrastructure costs associated with that. We also have some unknowns related to the level of federal, state, and other funding that's going to be available to us at this time. We would be able to put funding to use for infrastructure, but again, we don't know what the full number is. So our recommendation here was, if you chose to prioritize this project, some number less than 16 million might be something to consider that would be of value still for the city to execute some infrastructure. So we're currently underway in a study of several sites with a consultant. We anticipate having some results by June of 2023 that would give us some sense of the condition of some significant locations where we park vehicles to understand what type of infrastructure needs do exist. That will help us know what our needs will be, and then work with our Budget and Research Department, Finance Department, and others on securing the funding that's not otherwise secured through any recommendations from the bond program.
But to your point, Vice Chair Steller, I think that this is merely a suggestion. It's not a recommendation, and you can do with it whatever the subcommittee desires.
Any other thoughts from subcommittee members?
I'll just say something.
Go ahead.
This one's a tough one because while our two comm vendors did mention electric vehicle, like I said, I sat on this committee, and it was a lot of work with a lot of recommendations that came out of the TEAP program. And I think a little bit of it feels a little bit cart before the horse. We don't know the funding amount and the mechanisms that are going to be necessary to have the city transfer all of their vehicles or even a large portion of it until we know what the infrastructure needs is. This is a very large city, very large needs. And this is notwithstanding the fact that I don't believe that we should have clean air and get away from fossil fuels or anything like that. It's the reality of taking care of business so that we're doing it appropriately and correctly. The technology is changing. I have friends in different states. We've had many, over beers, conversations on Zoom talking about electric vehicles in other states and where they're at versus where we're at or where their cities are at. And I struggle with this because this was a very important project for me to serve on this committee and want to support anything and everything that the city can possibly do to go to electric vehicles. But if the city is telling me there's incremental steps that they need to take so that they're doing it appropriately, I got to listen to that. There are more experts on this than I was. I was just a committee member and a volunteer. And if they're recommending a lower amount, that's great, but I still feel the hesitancy in the memo that they're kind of waiting for the study to come out next at the end of the fiscal year. And if they felt it was appropriate to wait for this to be a proposed amount on the next bond committee, then I respect that. Doesn't mean that I don't believe that we should transition electric vehicles. Doesn't mean that I don't think that we want clean air faster. I just don't know if just giving money and throwing it at that gets us to that goal. And that's the problem. If that gets us to the goal that, geez, we give this 5.1 millions to EVs now and boom, we're going to get a percentage of clean air from that, that'd be great. But that is not the promise. So that's where I'm at.
Any other thoughts from committee members?
I do.
Chairwoman Torres, this is Shannon Scutari.
Okay, Shannon. We'll go Shannon, and then we'll do Pat.
Okay,
Sorry.
great. Thank you.
Ms. Scutari and Mr. Edwards.
Thank you. I really am really, wanting to second the comments of Subcommittee Member Perez. And I really hear also Subcommittee O'Grady's urgency on having some sort of strategy on how this actually can be prioritized within the city of Phoenix. And clearly the subcommittee or the committee that Subcommittee Perez has worked on for several years has teed up the city to prioritize these things. Having funding attached to those prioritizations will make the city focus on those things and prioritize them. However, if there isn't a strategy to utilize the funding in a way that leads to the kinds of outcomes that Subcommittee O'Grady is speaking to, then we are just allocating some money and then we're not really knowing exactly how the implementation strategy is going to play out to the proper outcomes. So having said that, is there a way that we could encourage the executive committee to prioritize some sort of implementation strategy? I don't know if there's a funding that needs to happen with that, that needs to be attached to do that. But clearly it is a priority. I mean, look at all the people that have really put so much time into trying to figure out how the city can electrify its fleets and be a sustainability leader in the country on these issues. So I know money, when we attach money to it, it seems like, okay, now we're really forcing that as a priority, but we don't want to allocate funding towards something that isn't going to be properly utilized. So those are just sort of random thoughts. Is there a way for us to have some sort of influence on how this actually is going to not get lost in the sustainability and environmental prioritization if we do not allocate any funding towards it?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. My comment is gauged more toward coming to conclusion for the purpose of this committee. I think it's important to remember that this is a bond. It is not the entire city budget. I think it's also important to remember that given the size of the city budget and the messaging associated with this particular subcommittee of $20 million, let's use that number as a target, that The purview of the committee is not to change maybe the course of the city or influence the city's thinking, but rather to message to the community who's going to vote for this bond that our intention is that we want to focus on those projects that are sensitive to the environment and important to sustainability. Therefore, my recommendation to the committee would be to stay on point with the fact that we're here to approve $20 million and to assign priority to that. Having said that, I then suggest that maybe for the sake of expediency, rather than attending or sending a specific dollar amount to each one of these, if we look at the list and we say, okay, of the four, the energy, water, and efficiency, heat resiliency, brownfield redevelopment projects, and electrification, if you look at that and say, okay, those are the four we choose to want to move forward with, that we assign a percentage value to each one. To be more poignant on that, I would say, if you look at these numbers, you're saying 60% goes to energy and water, 20% goes to heat resiliency, 10% to brownfield, 10% to fleet electrification. That would be a much easier way to identify rather than putting specific values to each one of these and then coming up with an overall recommendation on the budgeting that this committee wishes to go forward to executive committee. It's not to take away from any of the comments that have been made to date, but to try and zero in on an answer for this committee, I recommend that perhaps instead of, again, in talking specific value amounts, that maybe we can land on a percent funding for each one of these, and in that percent funding for that, we then demonstrate the message we wish to take to the public for their vote. Thank you.
Thank you. That is an interesting concept. And I also kind of did the same thing, because what I did in my head was I looked at the revised amounts and I halved them all. And so it kind of did what you're talking about to make them easier to look at. And if we halved them all, we would end up with around 20.5 million right now. So that can give you an idea of like where the dollar amounts will end up if we make them in like more realistic numbers in terms of what needs to come out of the subcommittee.
And just a quick comment, and nothing stops the executive committee. If we put a lower amount and they decide that they want to add a higher amount based on their opinions or whatever, they're allowed to do that at exec committee, right?
Yeah, these are recommendations to the executive committee and anticipate that they will likely be changed at some point. Go ahead, Ms. Enrine.
Thanks, Chair Torres. This is sort of an impossible task for us this morning because I think that, as one of our community members spoke earlier this morning, to only have $25 million of a $500 million bond to tackle environment and sustainability issues feels sort of overwhelming, because I think if we look at the four remaining projects on this list and we think about our charge as a subcommittee to fund things that cannot reasonably be deferred, and we think about water and energy efficiency, and we think about heat resiliency and brownfields and the transition to electric vehicles, all of these things cannot reasonably be deferred. The impacts of climate change are affecting our community not in another 5 years when we have the opportunity to do a bond again. They're affecting our community members now, and they're affecting communities of color and lower income communities more deeply and more intensely and earlier than other parts of our community. So I feel sort of at a loss about how we can, in good conscience, reduce any of the funding for these programs. So not to make your job more difficult, Chair Torres, but I am really grateful for the work of staff and for all of the community members that have commented through this process thus far. But I think that I'm sort of thinking that we should, with whatever recommendations we pass along to the executive committee, really encourage them to think about how important environment and sustainability programs and projects are, and that really all of these remaining 4 projects deserve funding, and that we've seen from the community members' comments thus far that people are really interested in heat resiliency, that they're really interested in transitioning to electric vehicles, and that these are things that are exciting to voters and to members of the public, and that if we're going to ask the City of Phoenix residents to vote to fund this bond, or to vote to pass this bond, that these are projects that really deserve to be included in the final package that goes to voters next year. So I think we have an impossible task this morning. Sorry to make your job less easy.
So to follow up on your comments, would you agree that the 60%, 20%, 10% are the right amounts, or do you think that those percentages should be higher or lower for any one of those?
I think that's probably the percentages feel like, okay, that seems like one way to start tackling this problem.
Vice Chair Steller, did you have a comment?
Madam Chair, I'd just like to echo what Subcommittee Member Unrein said. I think just thinking about this in terms of process and what might hopefully make the Executive Committee's job easier is I think the percentages are a good kind of back of the envelope benchmark. I would keep the ranking in terms of a tool because I think of this like a city may approach this as a project dollar amount, thinking of that in terms of how these projects will be funded. And so what I would suggest is keeping the ranking as such, and then the Executive Committee can then cut a project if they don't want to fund that project. But I think we look at the merits of the project, see if it merits funding, and then rank among those, and then go to the Executive Committee, and they can take projects out if they need to. I think I've seen that from other subcommittees for this GEO bond. It seems to work because then we're just making fewer decision points of cutting across the board arbitrarily versus specific projects that were deprioritized by this committee but still merited consideration.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, at the end of the day, we're going to have to provide the dollar amounts and the prioritization for this. I think just for the sense of, are the dollar amounts in the range of our value levels for each of these projects? That's what I think the percentages are helpful for, because then we can cut across the board if we know that we want, like we can have a total in mind and then cut across the board, get to those ranking numbers easier if we have the percentages, if we're kind of aligned on percentages for the projects. As it is right now, did we say it's 60, 20, 10, and 10? Is that what it is right now? I didn't do the math.
That was just the math I used. I think it's easier to get a consensus on the percentage. To use your words, each person would give a value to those categories, and then from that, we move forward.
Chairwoman Torres, I did want to also add that when we answered the survey, there were, strong support for more funding, particularly for the heat resiliency. And then, obviously support for less funding for vehicle electrification. So we're already on record, or even do not fund on electrification and do not fund on fuel and oil tank replacement. So we're already on record, I think, recommending even more funding for some of these items and less funding for others.
So what I'm seeing is that heat resiliency is getting more funding than we started with by $11 million because it wasn't proposed to have any funding during this GEO bond process. Right now, based on the numbers, and that EVs started with 16 million and is down to 5 million, but started with 0. So they're up 5 million right now.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, just to be responsive on the point on electric vehicles too, I think a study is absolutely necessary. I am getting memories of the Tree and Shade Master Plan, which was a plan in 2014, I believe, but was not attached to funding. So I have concerns of plans not attached to funding, which I realize we'll know a lot more by the time January comes around with the bond. So I am, again, in favor of advancing a $5 million recommendation for electric vehicles. I think EPA, Department of Transportation, all of those folks will hopefully have more NOFOs out and we'll know more about what funding will be available. But I'm just worried about a position in 2029 where we did not have enough funding for EVs and we would have more electric vehicles in our fleet. We have a pretty modest year-to-year estimate for transition. I think that can be accelerated with more funding.
May I then ask Subcommittee O'Grady then, are you suggesting that if the number, just for fact, if the number is 25 million, that you're suggesting that vehicle electrification warrants 20%?
I think with this ranking, I would simply say that these projects, that we go project by project, and if the executive committee thinks that we need to cut a project, they go ahead and do that, but I'm not for arbitrarily cutting by 20% or sticking with the $25 million number. I think that's going to be really, really tough for us, and so I think we instead look project by project, recommend what is merited, and then have a rank order that then the executive committee can come back to and say, well, okay, we really need to stick to $25 million, so we have a list here that we can go back to and say, okay, EV was the last item, we cut the EV. That's what I'm saying, is I think will be helpful for the executive committee to stay within the $500 million and also weigh between the different recommendations from the other executive or the other subcommittees where, you know, you're having recommendations of $150 million, where I think that balancing will be easier with the ranking.
So my thoughts are is that we were put on this subcommittee because we have the knowledge to prioritize and rank these projects. The executive committee is a more diverse group of folks from different walks of the community. So if we provide them way over budget amounts, they're not going to have as much of the expertise to cut that down. So I feel like it's our responsibility to provide them a reasonable number that is in line with what was asked of this committee in the first place. Vice Chair Steller.
Madam Chair, I agree. I think my worry is exactly that by kind of giving an over, and I agree entirely with committee member Ryan about it does feel like frankly, an impossible task, and it is, it is disappointing to me to not see a higher amount allocated towards this really important topic. And I do wonder if that can be part of our communication to the executive committee. But at the same time, my worry is that if we don't get it into the ballpark of what was asked of us, that then that kind of would put the onus on the executive committee to make a decision that may be less informed than the one that we would make. So as difficult as it is, and again, I would fully support, some very clear communication to the executive committee that both in absolute numbers and proportionally, it does not feel sufficient to meet the challenges. But nonetheless, we've provided a framework for them to work at within that. And I think I'd rather we make the decision about whether something should be cut or whether a proportional cut should be made than asking the executive committee to do that in the context of a $500 million budget, because then I worry that these issues won't get the attention they deserve at all, and potentially could even, it could even be less advantageous.
Thank you.
Madam Chair?
Yeah, go ahead, Gene.
It's Gene D'Adamo again. I echo what both you have said and Vice Chair Steller, that I think we do have an obligation to come in that ballpark for the reasons that you stated, both of you stated. And a point of clarification for Member O'Grady, was your suggestion that we look at the merits of each project and come up with a realistic amount versus doing the global 60-20-20? Is that what I heard you say? It's a little hard to hear when some of you all talk from where I'm listening.
Yeah, I think just to clarify, I think there's been a lot of work that have gone into these numbers of projects, so I don't think we could get into increasing, decreasing, but I think a lot of that work has been baked. And I think just in terms of the amount, I am worried the executive committee is more likely to decrease than increase. And I think if we create a slate of projects that are ready to fund, I hope they go ahead with them. As a resident of Phoenix, I hope that they increase from 5% of and one of the younger members of the committee who's going to be living here the longest, I have concerns, and I hope that the executive committee funds these projects. I don't want to give them any way to any permission to not recommend a project, and then it's off the cutting block. That is my concern with this process.
I agree with you.
With respect to those comments, I feel that first, while I may not be the youngest person on the committee, I have people that I care about that will be here for a long time. I don't think age is the issue. Rather, I think the inference to the committee is to get the job done. We have a task to complete, to submit to the executive committee, pick the number, $20 million that we need to get done. It's important that we first, before we polish the facets of the diamond, that we cut it out of the mountain. And therefore, it's important that we identify where we want and in what categories we wish to spend the money. Secondarily, then, to identify specific projects within each one of those categories that we'd request the executive committee pay special attention to. Thank you.
So, where have we gotten in these deliberations? I guess my recommendation here would be to get us to closer to the number that we're aiming for, at least back to the budget that we started with, even within the range of the budget. If we could see what these numbers look like if we cut them all by 25%. Would that be something that you guys want to see on the revised list so that we could be closer to, like I said, if we cut them all in half, it would be at a $20.5 million total. Also, can we see the total? Can you add a line that shows the total at the bottom so we know where we're at? Please.
And Madam Chair, the far right column is the cumulative total. So the bottom number there is currently the 41.1 million you're seeing.
Okay.
Is the total that you're at.
Wait, why is that on the side, though?
So you're seeing on the far right a running total.
Okay.
And I understand the committee's direction now is you would like to see each of these numbers reduced by 25%. Is that correct?
Yes.
And as you can see, Madam Chair, everyone is focused on their calculators at the moment. So we will.
I know. I was letting you guys have the time.
And I just want to make a quick comment. For those of you that may or may not be watching the other subcommittees, I painfully watched the Parks and Recreation Committee go through this process, and it was painful even just as a viewer because they went through each one, and it's like, well, let's just take off $1 million from that one. No, let's add 500,000. It was very painful, but it was their charge to provide that recommended amount of money. And I'm sure it was painful for the committee members, a lot of give and take. I'm sure there was some hurt feelings on there, et cetera. And again, watching it, I was like, this almost the whole time when they were doing funding. So it stinks. You're right. We don't have enough funding for this. I understand it, but I think that is our charge.
So now with that cut across the board to the remaining projects, it looks like the cumulative is 30.8. I still don't get this column on the right side, how that. Oh, okay. So it's not like, okay. Apparently, okay. So this is a lot closer to the goal being what we started with, which was, do we have the exact number on the goal, on what we started with? Was it
25.4.
4? So thoughts on these numbers, folks? Are we wanting to increase or decrease any of the allocations that look any different?
Can I ask, is there a reason, did I miss a step? Why are we showing accumulation of 30,800,000 when the accumulated number should be closer to 25 million, what, 25 million one?
Oh, because that's the total that we have now in the revised. That's what, if you add them all up?
It's just an iteration of it. This is just an illustrative.
So, Madam Chair, committee members, just to clarify what the step that was just taken there, we took the numbers that the committee was at a moment ago and reduced each one by 25%.
Sounds like everyone's digesting what they see on the screen.
So can I ask, what is there another column available to see what the revised amounts would be if we were shooting for 25.1?
Mm-hmm.
No.
So you would allocate according to these percentages to get to 25.1?
Yes, if we, and I'm not suggesting we do 60, 20, 10, 10. That was just a number we tossed out there. But if we did those percentages and they totaled the 25.1, what would they be? It would then be the purview of the group to be able to say, for instance, not suggesting that instead of 60, it's 55, 25. I'd like to see that.
Okay.
So, Madam Chair, committee members, to clarify on that, is the suggestion that what you're seeing in the revised total right now is the allocation that the committee would like to see, and then the question is just how you, based on that percentage allocation, get to 25.1 million?
Yeah, but can you put it in another column? So we still have the $30 million in one column, and then we have the $25.4 million total in another column, the same allocation rates.
Madam Chair, so I think to get to 25 million, so a 38% cut would be the number across the board.
From the original?
From the original total, yes. So 40, so 25 divided by 40, so about 38. Yep.
Madam Chair?
Yes. Jean, go ahead. Dinamo,
Yeah.
Mr. Dinamo.
A question. I think the way to go is the percentages seem to make sense for our task that we are charged with. But do we, based on some of the feedback from the other committee members on the electric vehicles, do we want that maybe to be 5%? If you look at the ranking, it's number 4, and some of the comments were there's not really a well-articulated plan yet where the money would go. So do we look at maybe making it that 5% versus 10%?
That makes sense to me. Do you have a recommendation on where you would reallocate that 5%?
I can't see. I was thinking if we cut that to 5, we would get closer to the 25 million because you just.
Oh, so just cut it out completely and not reallocate.
Yeah. No, not reallocate it. No, you would just cut out that 5% to see where we're getting.
Chairwoman Torres.
Okay.
This is Shannon's guitar. I was wondering if also doing a scenario with removing the fuel and oil tank replacement.
That one is removed already.
It is removed. Okay, so the allocations are done. Yeah,
it's just confusing because the totals are on the side and not at the bottom.
Yep. Got it. And it's in red, so it's hard for us to see, I think, on camera, which is fine, but I just have to squint a little bit here. That's all right. Thank you. There we go.
So you can see now the amounts on the far right side. If we were to target a $25.1 million total budget, the amount for energy and water efficiency at the current rates that they're allocated, and we can adjust these, but at the current rates, it would be about $12 million for energy efficiency, water efficiency, about $6.7 million for heat resiliency, about $3 million for brownfields, and $3 million for EVs. In this scenario, if we do want to take Subcommittee member Adamo's suggestion and change the EV allocation to 5%. Right now, it's at a 10% allocation. then we could reallocate that $1.5 million to one of the other
Madam Chair,
areas.
hopefully just to make it easier, I would, at risk of splitting the baby, I would reduce the EV portion to 1.5 million and then move that up. So EV would be down to 1.3, move the 1.5 up to energy efficiency. Because these I know folks put time into these rankings. I don't want an across-the-board cut to every single one of them because different projects have more merit. And so with EV being the lowest ranked recommended project, I think down to 1.5 and then up.
To the top?
2.3, increase number one, energy efficiency by 2.3. And hopefully renewables will help fuel the EVs.
That makes sense to me. Everyone, does that make sense to other committee members? All right.
Chairwoman Torres, I would love to hear Chair Subcommittee Member Perez's comments about that, because it sounds very reasonable to me, but she's on the front lines of this issue.
Sure, go ahead. Yeah, cutting the EV budget by half, and
Again,
in the amounts on the far right side with the 25.1 target, cutting the EV $3.1 million in half and reallocating the other half back up to the energy and water efficiency.
Thanks, Shannon, but I don't know if I'm the expert on this. I mean, again, that memo I didn't feel like was any kind of a charge. I felt like that memo, that paragraph was basically saying that they were comfortable with this being a future, and if we were going to fund it at a lower rate, they were fine with that. So I am very comfortable with that.
Okay. Sounds like there's consensus. Staff, do you mind making the change, please?
So, Madam Chair, with your permission, we'll go ahead and revise the primary numbers that are in column O so that we don't have too many scenarios going at once, and treat that as the working numbers for the subcommittee.
Okay. Looks like everybody...
While they're doing that, can I ask staff, is there value in, what's going to end up being probably about a $1.3 million EV allocation? I guess there's maybe symbolic value, but can you speak to, can you really do meaningful work at that point?
Chair and Vice Chair Stoller, 1.5 certainly. We do know that we received generously supplemental funding from Mayor and Council for this year to do some of the study work that's underway. Of course, the cost of that study work came in much higher than what that funding was hopeful to achieve. So certainly we might be able to study additional sites that we're unable to study at this time. In terms of actual, if they identify that the infrastructure needs require a new transformer and new electrical switchgear, et cetera, 1.5 million at one of these larger sites probably doesn't do much. So it could help with the study. It could help with some smaller capital need that's identified, and that would be probably about the extent of it.
And if I could add, Vice Chair, certainly that has much more value if it all happens on the front end rather than split over 5 years. So we would work with that number to maximize the utility of that 1.5 in that way.
So I think the new numbers are input into the original revised column now. So we're
Madam Chair, that's in progress.
Oh, it's in progress.
So bear
Sorry.
with us for one moment.
I'm just glad I'm not doing the math here, so feel the pressure. I hope my kids can watch this on the replay. This is how important math is. Oh, yeah. Go ahead, Ms. Enright.
While we're waiting, I would ask maybe if my other subcommittee members, as we were discussing, I was thinking about what Vice Chair Steller had proposed, that we, need to send something to the executive committee that, we've decided upon versus sending them a wish list that will probably be cut. But I wonder if we might, along with the final numbers that we send to the executive committee, express that this is really essential that the city of Phoenix and that this bond invest more in environment and sustainability, and perhaps attach that original list of projects that came out to the $41 million and say, realistically, this is what we think cannot be deferred, and this is what we thought, not just pie in the sky, we want to fund everything, but we think that this is actually the list of items that cannot be reasonably deferred until the next bond, but recognizing that we were given this task of funding $25 million, $25.1 million in this bond, this is what we ultimately came up with, but it is woefully inadequate for the pressing climate change needs or climate change concerns that the city of Phoenix has.
I think that's a great idea. And I believe staff will be writing the report for us, so after they finish the tabulations.
And Madam Chair, if committee members would like to look at what you're seeing on your screens now, this is kind of our understanding of what was being proposed.
Okay, so can the public all see this right now? Anyone that's watching, they can see the screen?
Yes, they can.
Okay, just making sure I didn't have to go through and... Okay, any thoughts on what's on the screen? This totals out to $25.1 million currently. Some head shaking, yes.
Chairwoman Torres, I have a couple of comments. Just to go back to Mr. Edwards' points about how this is really ultimately in the hands of the voters, and a real high percentage of folks that have come out and taken their volunteer time to focus on the importance of climate change and heat resiliency and sustainability in our desert environment. I don't know if the impact of such a small amount in such a large bond amount for heat resiliency is going to be as impactful for the voters when they hear about the projects that might be funded from that. And I'm just trying to connect in the $7 million amount for heat resiliency back into what the voters will be voting on with this entire bond package of $500 million. And I understand public safety and the prioritization of all of those important safety measures for the firefighters, and we're hearing more and more about that. I understand that needs to be a big part of what we convey to the voters. I also know that in our public comments, we are hearing more and more and more from people that are focusing on the heat resiliency piece. And I just bringing that to everybody's attention because I just wonder how impactful we can really be with cutting the budget of the heat resiliency office by, $4 million. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Scutari. And just to clarify that, I don't think this isn't cutting the budget of the heat office at all. The heat office is funded through a different process. This will supplement the budget of the heat office, correct? Can staff confirm, please?
Yes, absolutely. Madam Chair, this does not alter the budget of the office in any way. This is an amount that's allocated for capital needs associated with the office's work.
One more thing. And this, although it is, so the heat resiliency measure was, as you all know, not funded at all in the initial proposal for this bond process, and it is now at $7 million for the bond process.
Madam Chair, I just wanted to add that responsive to Subcommittee Member Scutari's comments, I think and the per unit benefit of funding a tree versus funding a heavy-duty refueling station for an electric vehicle, I think I'd be fine with going ahead and zeroing out the electric vehicle stations and moving that allocation up to heat resiliency. I do feel like we are selling the farm here a little bit. I hope, we need advocacy at the executive committee, we need advocacy at the council. I will be disappointed if $25 million is the number that comes down from the executive committee. My understanding again of our role was to recommend projects that merit funding. And it's nice that we're doing this budget work for them. But I think the recommended totals on the left are what we thought needed funding, and I hope they at least see that. I think that should have been the extent of our recommendations. So just for the continuing Excel workshop, item 4, rank 4, 1.3, I would be in favor of reallocating that to heat resiliency given the benefit of additional trees that can fund.
So I guess my question to subcommittee members for that, cutting the entire budget for EVs, is this an important area to invest in for the messaging aspect of this bond? Is it important to remind our community that this is a priority for our city? And back to Vice Chair Steller's point, is an allocation of $1.3 million worthwhile in this area? I don't have the answer to that.
Madam Chair, it's Gene D'Adamo.
Go ahead.
I think from a marketing standpoint, it would be better for the public, the fewer things they're going to look at. I'm assuming, I think this is clarified in one of our former meetings, that when they vote on the bond election, they'll see hopefully $25 million for environment sustainability, and they'll see the list of projects. Am I correct? And the amounts?
Can staff clarify, please?
Madam Chair, committee members, the city's historical practice has not been to itemize a list of projects with dollars. That's not to say that the city council may adopt that form of ballot, but based on historical practice, the ballot has not included itemized projects. It's more program areas.
So it would say, just to clarify, it would say environment sustainability, 25.1 million, and it wouldn't even list the categories, energy and renewable, water and renewable energy, heat resiliency. There would not be any reference to those if we're consistent with past bond elections on the ballot.
Madam Chair, committee members, it's indeterminate at this point how many ballot propositions there would be or what their scope would be based on historical practice. Okay. Whatever those propositions end up being, typically they have not shown itemized projects with itemized dollars by project.
Okay. And if that's the case, then I would be in favor of definitely reallocating the EVP to the heat resiliency, because if it's not a marketing thing for the public, then we can focus on the areas that have the most immediate impact. And I do agree that if you look at 1.3 million for a program that important, it does almost seem like we're just doing that to pacify. I don't know. It's not meaningful enough to even make it worthwhile, in my feeling. So I'd rather have that money go somewhere else.
Madam Chair, if I may.
Yeah, go ahead.
You had asked me a question some time ago, and I gave my best response at the time, and I've been thinking about it a little bit more. So just to put it in terms of level 2 chargers, $1.3 million, based on some quick math I did with Mark, might be about 50 or so level 2 chargers of investment. So to give you a sense for what it would buy in terms of level 2 chargers at today's prices, the chargers themselves. Thank you.
And sorry, Joe, can you clarify if those chargers if this money under EVs would be for internal city chargers or both public use and city use? In theory. I hope.
I think it could be it would be at city facilities, Chairwoman. It would be certainly charging at city facilities. It could be to support either or both the city's charging needs for its own fleet and or public charging access for charging infrastructure as well.
Thank you. Did I have some questions or comments from this side? No? Okay, go ahead.
I just blanked. So when you're talking about, they're talking about for the public community centers, it could be a library, et cetera, public pool, those are community facilities, so people would have access to those. And then I just wanted to add to Jean's comment about the marketing. I'm assuming, and I shouldn't make an assumption, but assuming that even though it won't be on the ballot as an itemized, as that would be a ridiculous ballot to look at, I assume that there will be some sort of a website that will break it down somewhere that people will be able to go in and see what does it mean by, sustainability and environment. And they could go to the website and get more information. And that's what's going to probably be pushed out for marketing purposes for this bond, I'm assuming. Is that correct, or did you not do that either?
Madam Chair, committee members, yes, public information would be available aside from what is just on the ballot. At a minimum, certainly the council's recommendations for the bond program would be public information that would be available to voters, to give voters an idea of what the city would intend to spend various bond propositions on.
Madam Chair, just a quick point to understand from last bond campaign that also, I think regardless of what is on the city website, word of mouth is going to be very important. So we will be talking to our friends and family about this bond and why it's important. And so I think, it would be great to have links we can send them to and voter information. But I think beyond that, the word of mouth and just being able to say solar panels, heat resiliency, all of these things that are so important we're funding is great.
So I have an alternate proposal to Subcommittee Member O'Grady's suggestion, which is cutting the brownfields budget a little bit and reallocating some of that budget to heat resiliency, because the brownfields was at, I think we brought it through at about 10%. So if we cut some off of that and move that up, that way we could keep funding for EVs.
Agreeable to that.
I would agree with that.
Okay, so how much? The age-old question. So right now we could make it a round number, moving the $200,000 up to heat resiliency. We could maybe make it $2.5 million for brownfields and then move up the remainder to heat resiliency. That seems like a nice number, round number. And I think it would still accomplish some of the goals of the city with regards to the brownfields redevelopment.
Yeah, I would just ask staff if there's kind of a minimum number that does accomplish those goals so that, again, we don't divide the baby up too much.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Vice Chair Steller. Understanding from staff what can and can't be done, I would recommend not going below 3 for brownfields.
Did you say 3?
Yes.
Okay. So then let's take the $200,000 and move it up. Everyone, go ahead. So any other thoughts on the revised numbers, what you're seeing in front of you? Everybody feeling comfortable with these numbers? Any other changes that we want to make? Those on the WebEx, please chime in as well.
Madam Chair, it's Gene D'Adamo. Just to confirm, and I'm fine with the way the numbers are, we are not going to zero out the electric vehicles. We're keeping it at 1.3.
I think that's what there is consensus for. I think given the additional information provided by the city in terms of what they could do with the $1.3 million, it sounded substantial to me, and it sounded like something that would be beneficial to our communities, both on the city facility side for the city fleet and also for public access.
I completely support that. I just was making sure. These numbers look good to me.
Yeah, no, I think before we had clarification, the thought was like maybe that wasn't enough to do anything substantial with, but.
Right.
Madam Chair. So I think this is a good ranking. Again, the root problem I think that we all feel is that there's just not a big enough pie to begin with, and so it's going to be painful no matter what. And I really do. I thought it was an excellent suggestion by Committee Member Unrein to, to really communicate that in a very clear way when we do so to the Executive Committee. But and I agree. Of course, I would love to see much more for EVs. I would love to see much more for heat resiliency. I agree, very passionately with all those comments. But I think this is a good starting point. And I'll also note too that this is our initial 25.1. So what we didn't do, and which I am agreeing we should not do, is cut by a further 20%, which it was one way to think about this. And I think for a few reasons. One is, again, that I think to go any lower would be a disservice, so I would not support that we do that. And I'll note, something we heard from staff, which is item 1, also, which we've invested in heavily, deals with significant backlog of maintenance issues because the city hasn't done a bond since 2006, and so I would hope that the Executive Committee would give that additional weight, the fact that we do not cut further. So I'm supportive of the list generally as is. I'm open to additional tweaks, but I'm supportive as is, and I would not. I would suggest we stay with this ballpark rather than cutting by an additional 20.
Thank you. I agree as well with all the comments that have been made about the budget, and I don't know if staff caught that conversation and comment from Subcommittee Member Unrein about attaching a narrative with this that ideally all of these would be funded at their full amounts, but we have gone through the exercise in this subcommittee to pare it down to what was asked of us initially in the subcommittee. So I just wanted to make sure staff was aware of that because you guys were crunching the numbers while that conversation happened.
Madam Chair, just to clarify on that comment, I think at the point in time where Committee Member Unrein had made that comment, the total was about $40 million, which was the dollars in the original column, with the exception of EV, I think at that point had been listed as 5.1 million. Is that what the committee would like to include in the narrative, or is it column N, the original amounts, including 16.3 for EV?
My recollection is that it was the 20 million, 11 million, 5 million, and then the 5 million, and then 0 for fuel tank in this subcommittee. But separately, the subcommittee is also saying fuel and oil tank replacement may be a worthwhile project for the Executive Committee to fund in another source if that is needed for operations of our city's fleet at this time. Correct? Seeing heads shaking over here. Okay. Go ahead,
Will
Ms.
all
Perez.
the reports be available online that are coming from all the subcommittees before exec committee? Because the exec committee is next Monday, so that's 1 week away. So I'm assuming that they're either going to be attached to their agenda, or are they going to be on the website, or how are they going to be presented?
Madam Chair, committee members, subcommittees are in the process of finalizing their memos. As of this morning, I believe 3 of the subcommittee reports are posted on the Phoenix.gov/bond website, and they'll be posted on a rolling basis as those memos are approved by chairs.
And I believe the presentation for the results of this subcommittee to the Executive Committee will be on October 24th. The Executive Committee meeting on October 24th.
Yes, Madam Chair. So on the 17th, 4 of the subcommittees will report, and on the 24th, then the other 4, including this subcommittee, will report.
Okay, so are we ready to make a motion here to move on with this process, finalize these numbers and the recommendation of the additional memo? the fuel and oil tank replacement, I guess, as part of that motion to be recommended to the, or do we need these all in separate motions, or how would you suggest it, staff, for us to move forward?
Madam Chair, committee members, for simplicity, I'd suggest first taking the 4 items that are shown on your screen now, and that could simply be a motion to recommend the executive committee, which is shown on the screen, and then separately to deal with the fuel and oil tank project as a separate motion.
Okay. So could I please get a motion to recommend the projects as funded on the screen in the rank order of priority as well? As shown, yeah. You want to make the motion?
Madam Chair, members of the subcommittee, I move to motion to approve the rankings as stated of the Energy and Watershed Efficiency and Renewable Energy, Heat Resiliency, City Brownfields Redevelopment Project, and City Vehicle Electrification Stations, accumulating in a total of 25.1, with also the recommendation that we forward the city tanks to the Executive Committee for their consideration without a recommended funding source from us.
Oh, you did it all at once. Okay. That works too.
Is that okay?
Yeah. Can I have a second, please?
I second.
Thank you, Vice Chair Steller. Is there any additional discussion on the ranking order, the proposed amounts, and the addition of the recommendation of the fuel tank projects for consideration of the Executive Committee?
Madam Chair, will vote yes to build consensus, but I have concerns about not recommending a project, but then recommending it be considered. I feel like that's kind of extracurricular from what we're doing, but it sounds like that is what is supported, so I'm happy to go ahead with that.
I think in my rationale is that the city proposed that project to fund operations, although it doesn't fit within we've determined that it doesn't fit within the scope of our subcommittee. Maybe it is needed for city operations under a different purview. Any other additional comments? All right, all those in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
All those opposed, please say nay. And anyone that's abstaining from the vote, please indicate. All right, so we have unanimous approval of the amounts, the order, and the recommendations. And also, what we didn't include in that motion was the proposal to add that addendum in the comments of the committee that state that the ideal funding would be at the highest levels possible.
Thank you, Madam
Although we
Chair.
are working within the realm of possibility here.
Members of the subcommittee, we can certainly include that in the narrative of the report.
Thank you. All right, let's see. So we don't have any further agenda items in our subcommittee. This is the last meeting of our subcommittee. Oh, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to remind the subcommittee of our next steps. So this is the final meeting of this subcommittee. Thank you for your work, all of you. So staff will prepare a draft of the final report from this subcommittee, and that will go to our chair, and she will approve it, and we'll send it on to the executive committee. Of course, we'll share it with all of you once it's finalized, but that's the next step, and then this subcommittee's report would go to the executive committee on October 24th. So just those are next steps, just to make sure everybody's on the same page.
And as a reminder, the first executive committee meeting to discuss all of the subcommittee reports is next Monday, I believe, the 17th. And then that discussion will continue on to the following Monday after that, which is the 24th, when the results of this subcommittee meeting will be discussed. Thank you to everybody that has been involved in this process. It hasn't been easy, and now we know the pleasure that our elected leaders serve at every day when they make these decisions. So again, you all were put on the subcommittee because of your expertise and knowledge areas, and I think it has all been a valuable activity, and I thank everybody for being open and transparent in their recommendations, and I believe we achieved the best possible result under the circumstances. However, we all wish the circumstances were different, and we all wish that there were more money. Thank you to staff, and thank you to members of the public for participating. Your voices were heard in this process. And staff, thank you for all of the follow-up research, answers to our questions, et cetera, that helped us make a more informed recommendation for the executive committee. With that...
Thank you for your excellent leadership.
Thank you. And with that, I will adjourn the meeting. Thank you, everybody, and happy Indigenous Peoples Day once again.
Thank you.